you've led many of these great institutions, and for Passion for Leadership, you're great at analyzing why big institutions are failing us. Why?
I think it's it will come as no surprise. I think it's a failure of leadership. One of the things that amused me and troubled me about Washington, D.C. when I was secretary was that people lose their jobs in D.C. all the time. But it's almost always for misbehavior in some way, some personal misdeed or whatever. When I fired somebody for not doing their job properly, it was astonishing to the entire Capitol. People couldn't believe somebody had actually lost his job, in a senior job in Washington, because he hadn't been competent enough. And in this case, it was the Secretary of the Army, and it was over the treatment of outpatient wounded warriors at Walter Reed. So I believe, and what I write about in the book, this is really about how there is a need for leaders in every organization, not just CIA and the Defense Department, but in churches, in scout troops, in cities and counties and states, who are passionate about making organizations serve the people who they are intended to serve better, to be more cost effective, to be more efficient, to be more user friendly. And the book is really about the techniques that you can use at every level in any kind of a job, a leadership role, to bring those improvements about. And it really, a lot of it is just common sense. The first thing is you have to figure out, diagnose what's wrong with the organization. How can we make it better? And my view is that the place to start is with the professionals that work in the organization. It's surprising how frequently the people on the front lines of an organization understand what's wrong and have ideas about how to make it work better, but nobody ever asks them. Every time I visited troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, I insisted on having a lunch or a meal with junior officers and junior enlisted. And I wouldn't allow any of their commanders in the room. And it was amazing how honest these young men and women would be with me about the problems they were encountering. And I've tried to do that in every job that I've had, and I think that it's important for leaders to do that everywhere. And then to formulate a vision or an agenda for change. Where do we want to go? What's the end game? What's the strategy for getting there? And then what are the techniques for implementing the strategy? So often people will either make a grand speech or formulate some kind of a grand strategy, and then there's no attention to what business people would call execution. How do you actually implement the changes that you want? And the book talks about those characteristics, those techniques, and it's accountability, holding people responsible. And part of the problem, one of the things that I talk about in the book, is that nowadays, particularly in the press, accountability is synonymous with blame. And the truth is, accountability needs to work both ways. When you hold people accountable and they're successful, they need to be rewarded. And when you hold people accountable and they fail, they need to pay the consequences for that. And it's transparency. I think that in too many organizations, too many bosses hold all the information of what they intend, what they want to do, where they're headed, very tightly inside. And the truth is, you need the support of the professionals in the organization to make any change work over time. And so transparency is important in any organization of getting people to work with you. And so there are a lot of these techniques that are described in the book, but it's really about, to go back to your original question, it's about a failure of leadership and the unwillingness of people to have the courage to say, what we're doing isn't good enough.
Dr. Gates, why in real-world bureaucratic institutions you almost never get all what you want when you want it?
Well, in the first place, because particularly in the public sector, there are always competing interests. I mean, and no matter, in the public sector, no matter whether you're at the local level, the state level, or the national level, you've got elected overseers who have their own agendas, their own interests, and their own biases. You have competing interests. You have a variety of stakeholders who have a voice in the way things get done, whether it's the local press or board of directors or whatever. And so often you will have to make some compromises. And the thing that I admired about Ronald Reagan was that Reagan had this image as being very ideological and having very strong philosophical views, and that was all true. But he was also very pragmatic. And Ronald Reagan, if he could get 60 or 70% of what he wanted from the Congress, he would take it in a heartbeat and then go back for the rest the next year. So it's not about, I'll give you an example. So in 2009, I cut 36 programs, 36 major programs in the Defense Department that were over cost, overrun, overdue, or no longer relevant. Most of my predecessors, at best, had cut 1 or 2 programs. Dick Cheney, when he was secretary, cut 2 programs. The A-12 fighter. Now, remember, this is 1991. The litigation on that decision was completed 2 years ago. And the second was he cut the Osprey, the Marine aircraft. By the way, the Osprey is still flying, and the Marines still use it. So I cut 36 programs. And I got the Congress to agree on 33 the first year, or at least not to oppose me. And I was willing to put off a couple of 3 because I bought a couple of votes on doing certain cuts immediately by not pressing the case on another program. And then I came back and got the other program later, the next year. So I got the other 3 programs in the following year. So it's not necessarily that you compromise your ultimate objective, but you realize that sometimes you can't eat the whole pizza in one bite. You have to take it a step at a time.